Good morning, everyone. Good morning. This is Danny Hypocracy. You're joining me for another live episode of The Left Lens. And as you can see, I am joined by Brian Berletic of the New Atlas for our monthly conversation. How are you doing this morning, or for you this evening, Brian?
I'm doing very well. It's great to be back.
Great. So before we get started, everyone, you know what to do as you're coming into this stream. Be sure to hit that like button so you can get more viewers into this stream. Of course, subscribe to the channel, hit that notifications bell so you do get notified by YouTube if and when we go live. And you can support this channel in a myriad of ways, Patreon being the best. So be sure to catch that link in the description to ensure this work is sustained and continues. And thank you to everyone in the chat, all of the moderators, all of the YouTube members, which is also an option for folks. And thank you to everyone who has joined this morning. But without further ado, Brian, I want to start off. I had a Patreon member. And so for those who don't know, if you subscribe on Patreon, you can submit questions to guests. You can suggest guests. And there are many other also options for you to engage with this work and to help support it. But one of my Patreon members, Cultists, they asked about something I wanted to cover and open with anyway, and that is your reaction to this ICC arrest warrant. So the International Criminal Court, the latest news is that they have issued an arrest warrant for Vladimir Putin and another Russian official as part of what they are calling child kidnapping. They're accusing them of kidnapping children from Ukraine and forcibly emigrating them to Russia. Now, what is your take on this? Because not only has Vladimir Putin and the Russian government and the Russian side said this has no jurisdiction over Russia. We do not recognize this legally. But so has the United States. The United States has said this is justified in the sense that they agree with the basis behind it. But they also, Joe Biden's administration is very clear, they also do not recognize this legally per se. So what's your take on this? This is a pretty interesting story, also kind of bizarre. But I'd like to know your reaction.
Well, it's bizarre because the West is resorting to increasingly desperate measures to try to gain some sort of leverage over the situation. Their own proxy war against Russia and Ukraine, the International Criminal Court, nobody takes that seriously. It's one of these so-called international institutions that are created by the West, for the West. The Western nations themselves using it against nations that they target don't adhere to it and are not subjected to it. The United States has committed the worst violations of human rights in the 21st century. And where's the ICC in regards to, say, the U.S. invasion of Iraq or Libya or Syria or Afghanistan? Nowhere to be found. So it's impossible to take it seriously. It has no credibility. It has no jurisdiction. So what is it? It's just a giant PR move. And we saw them kind of trying to build this over the last couple of months, these claims that Russia is kidnapping children. I mean, they're moving people out of an active war zone, which is actually their responsibility under international law to actually do that. And so it's the world upside down. The West is trying to penalize Russia for upholding its obligations under international law in armed warfare. You're supposed to remove the civilian population. So the whole thing makes no sense. But what else can they do?
Yeah, I mean, this is very true. And one of the interesting things about this is that there was a conflict during the Trump administration with the ICC. The Trump administration said, we don't recognize this body. We're not going to be a party to it. It's not as if Joe Biden has actually reversed that policy anyhow, which I think is by design, and that's why they don't recognize it. But again, the hypocrisy is pretty clear. Vladimir Putin is being targeted here, yet, I mean, the United States is a party to war crimes in Ukraine and elsewhere. Could you talk about that? Could you talk about what is the United States party to here? Because it seems to me when it comes to places like Bakhmut, and when it comes to just how involved the United States has been when it comes to all of the casualties, the whether they're civilian or military. The United States has a huge role to play here.
They do. I mean, this would not be going on right now if it wasn't for the United States sending weapons and ammunition to Ukraine. This would have ended a long time ago. But as a matter of fact, this wouldn't even have started. The United States is at the very center of this entire conflict, because it was in 2014 when the U.S. itself overthrew the elected government, put a quiet regime into power, and sent this catastrophe down the path to where it is right now. They overthrew a sovereign government. That is utterly illegal. Is done in contravention to the UN Charter. Its guarantees of political independence, the prohibition against political interference in another nation's internal political affairs. The U.S. is trampled all over international law. And you don't even need the ICC to deal with that. The UN should deal with it, but it's not going to, because unfortunately at the moment, if you don't have a proper balance of power globally, these international institutions will just be hijacked by whoever has the most power, which unfortunately is still the United States and the collective West. So this wouldn't even be happening if it wasn't for the United States. And then for them to turn it completely around and aim it at Russia when they started this whole thing very deliberately. We've talked about this, Daddy, the policy papers, the U.S. Think tanks talked about how they were going to do this to extend Russia, to draw them into a costly conflict. And so here's the conflict. It's premeditated, and they did it openly, signed and dated policy papers.
Yeah. And so, in the wake of this ICC decision too, to issue an arrest warrant. I'm wondering about not only the arrest warrant for Biden, but how about people like Olaf Scholz, who presided over, likely, or at least we have huge reason to believe that, Chancellor Olaf Scholz in Germany, perhaps many other, Norway, for example, the political leadership in Norway had deep knowledge of what was one of the biggest crimes of this conflict, which is the destruction of Nord Stream, which now has not gotten any attention really in the mainstream Western media, collective West mainstream media. But despite everything that's happened since then, it still hasn't gotten any attention. There's been calls for investigations. There was a UN Security Council hearing on this, and yet the United States keeps whistling by it.
But the impunity, the hypocrisy was always there. This so-called rules-based international order the U.S. presides over. But because it's in decline and things are not going the way they want, it's becoming desperate. And this whole process, the hypocrisy, the sense of impunity that they enjoy, it's becoming more and more obvious. And they're less concerned with covering it up and maintaining the illusion of some sort of international law that they're adhering to or upholding. That they can't afford to do that right now. And they're just scrambling from one thing to the next, and it's becoming more obvious to more and more people. Even just ordinary people are wondering what's going on. And if they ruled out Russia didn't blow up the pipeline, who does that leave? That means someone in the West or allied to the West did it.
Well, they're saying now, I know you've seen the reports on what U.S. intelligence is saying about a pro-Ukrainian group using a yacht. Unclear where, how they were able to get the means to do all of this, but that's who they're blaming now. Some unknown pro-Ukrainian group. What has been your take? Could you talk about that a bit? Your take on this? What has been said now that there has been some damage control attempted by the United States around Nord Stream? Because it feels like also the ICC arrest warrant, a lot of this is damage control. The U.S. isn't a party to the ICC, but the U.S. surely has a huge influence over it. And all of this feels like damage control and ramping up the propaganda war to do that.
Well, just a note on the ICC. Yes, the United States uses it all the time. They put pressure on the ICC to go after all nations that are targeted by the U.S. for being undermined or for regime change. So I think that's very important to understand. It doesn't sign on to it officially. It's not subject to it, but they're more than happy to use it. It's a weapon. It's lawfare. It's part of U.S. lawfare, essentially. Regarding the pipeline, this ridiculous conspiracy theory that they've spun up, people looking at that conspiracy theory are left even more certain that what investigative journalist Seymour Hersh wrote about how it actually most likely took place. I mean, they walk away more certain that that is the actual way it unfolded versus this ridiculous story about a yacht where people started pointing out, well, the weight of the like they didn't even think about this when they were making up this story. The weight of the explosives are just too much. So then they started saying, well, maybe they did it in trips, or maybe it's not. Okay, maybe it wasn't a yacht. Maybe it was a tanker. I mean, this is like this is childish and embarrassing, and this is what the leadership of the collective West and the media are. Well, some of them are starting to kind of question it, but still far too many people in far too high positions are trying to push this seriously.
Yeah, and this in all of it reminds me, it's kind of like you said, turning the world upside down or on its head. This almost feels like turning the kind of lies we've seen over and over again on their head, meaning instead of them preemptively or maybe predating interventionism in war, like the lies around weapons of mass destruction or Gaddafi and Viagra and all of those kind of lies, rather than doing that, as you're moving into escalation after escalation, it's now damage control. These kind of lies are now damage control around things like the Nord Stream attack, because it's absolutely absurd. It reminds me of how the Syrian rebels, quote unquote, were being portrayed, no matter what kind of weaponry they were touting and how big and how many times they would splinter and be seen with US officials like John McCain, etc. No matter how many times that happened, they were still portrayed and constantly portrayed as, oh, well, they're just Syrian civilians who've joined a cause to free the country from Assad. And that was just hammered in over and over and over again. It feels like they're trying to grab onto that in this moment. But unlike in Syria, now you had someone like Seymour Hersh, one of the most credible journalists of all time, literally expose how this happened, and the damage control just isn't as effective.
You're right, and that's a good point. That they're lying as a means of damage control rather than as a means of advancing their foreign policy objectives. I mean, we remember back in Syria from 2011 onward. I think at the time there wasn't much collective awareness, not as much as there is now. I think more and more people are starting to wake up to what's going on. And again, it all goes back to the emergence of multipolarism, and what multipolarism is in essence is alternatives. There's alternatives to the monopolies that the West has controlled for generations, really. And among those alternatives includes all kinds of media that people are tuning into because they're tired of being lied to. And when they see a story this ridiculous, it just reinforces in their mind how big the problem actually is and how necessary it is to seek out alternatives. And when you lose credibility, and we're all told this by our parents and our teachers growing up as children, trust is very hard to gain. It's very easy to lose, and then once you lose it, it's almost impossible to get back. And this is a problem that the West faces in all regards: politically, militarily, financially. We see these situations with the banks, the whole Western finance system. People have no faith in it anymore because of what they've done recently over the last year or two.
Right. Now, you talked about the financial crisis that's kind of bubbling and building. It seems like Credit Suisse is on its way out and about to merge, and that's a huge deal. That would be just a huge shock to the world economic system. But I wanted to segue to another question of legality, Brian. there has been footage released of this MQ-9 Reaper drone, which was allegedly downed by Russia recently in the Black Sea. And this footage was released to kind of like demonstrate, well, look, Russia actually did down it. Hard to even tell what's happening in that footage, but it's quite clear that Russia was very aware and was looking to address this MQ-9 Reaper drone, this U.S. drone that was flying incredibly close to Crimea. And so I'm wondering what your reaction has been to these developments, because there has been kind of an argument about legality here. The U.S. saying, oh, well, we're in international airspace, we can do what we want. Russia saying, you probably shouldn't be flying this close to us with a potentially armed weapon, a drone. What is your opinion on this? How have you seen these developments transpire for you?
Generally, if you're flying in international airspace or your ships are moving through international waters, then usually everything should be okay. But in this case, the United States is not doing innocent passage. They are there for a reason. They are contributing to the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. You were just asking earlier about the U.S. role in all of this. When you are at war with another nation, part of what you are doing every single day is collecting intelligence to help organize forces to target different positions, troops, facilities, infrastructure. And so that is what the U.S. is actually doing on behalf of Ukraine. They are playing that role in the conflict. So they are involved in the conflict, flying that close to Crimea, which has been considered by Russia Russian territory since 2014. There was a referendum, a decisive referendum. And I think it's very hard to even argue about the legitimacy of the referendum, because a U.S. government poll the year before said basically these people want to be part of Russia. They identify as Russian. They want to be part of Russia. So the whole idea of the U.S. bringing their drones that close, even if it wasn't it was in international airspace, but what was it doing there? It wasn't just passing by. It wasn't just doing routine surveillance or again. And think about it: the U.S. is located in North America. It's over 5,000 miles away from the Black Sea. So what is it doing there? And if it was the other way around, if it was Russia or China doing this, even if they were in international airspace, people would see it as unreasonable, unnecessarily provocative. And I saw people online asking, what if Russia and China did this? Isn't that interesting that we don't know? We have to ask that question because Russia and China don't do that. I saw someone say, well, they fly near Alaska, apparently oblivious that Russia is right on the other side of the Bering Strait from Alaska. I mean, that's one thing. That's understandable. If there were Russian drones flying in the Gulf of Mexico, that would be another issue. And I don't think people would see that as reasonable. I don't think what the U.S. was doing was reasonable. Russia has a right to defend itself. There's a drone that is actively participating in hostilities against the Russian Federation. They have a right to defend themselves against it. That's the way I see it, at least.
Yeah, I mean, I think this gets to the huge disparity in how the United States, how the collective West talks about their participation in this ongoing conflict in Ukraine versus their reality. The United States constantly says, Joe Biden constantly says, well, we're not real. The Pentagon says, oh, well, we're not a party to this conflict. And then they'll say, so on the one side of their mouth, they're saying that. On the other, they're saying, oh, we're going to support Ukraine for as long as it takes. Right. And that's what they've done. And so you're exactly right, Brian, that the drone, I mean, that is not some kind of benign operation that they're running there. That is all about conducting intelligence, and Russia should be very concerned and has the right to defend itself, as you said, for the sole sake alone that they have been very aware of what the United States has been saying about a place like Crimea. The United States, your take on this, it's like Crimea not only voted to be part of the Russian Federation, but throughout this conflict, there's been a back and forth, especially from the United States, about whether Ukraine should just go in and launch an assault on Crimea to take it back. I mean, I mean, whether there's disagreement and debate about that, which I do think there is debate about it, nonetheless, it's been something that's been very seriously discussed.
Yeah, well, again, I'll go back to the 2013 USAID and International Republican Institute poll. And the IRI is a subsidiary of the National Endowment for Democracy. And the reason they were conducting this poll was because they fully planned to intervene in Ukraine's internal political affairs. And they wanted to see which way it was going to go in Crimea. And when you look through the poll results, most people identified as either Crimean or Russian. A quarter, this was in 2013 before they really had a reason to, a quarter of the people living there wanted to rejoin Russia. And if they had to join some sort of economic union, the European Union or the customs union, they overwhelmingly wanted to join Russia and its union. So case closed. Those people want nothing to do with the U.S. installed client regime in Kiev. And for the U.S. to say, well, Ukraine should go in there and overrun it and take it over. I mean, they're talking about subjugating people who want nothing to do with the government in Kiev. And that's based on what the U.S., its own poll revealed. And so that, we always hear about sovereignty and democracy and self-determination. The people of Crimea determined their destiny, and it was with the Russian Federation, and the U.S. Encouraging Ukraine to override their self-determination. It demonstrates who is really at the core of this problem, who's really driving this issue, this conflict.
Yeah, definitely. And now I'd like we can segue to, I think it would be good to now talk about this spring offensive that we've been hearing a lot about in the Western mainstream media, that they're trying to prepare Ukraine for a spring offensive. Now we're hearing reports that such an effort would be a last-ditch effort. And there's murmurs coming out of the Pentagon saying, don't blow it, Ukraine. This seems to be a pretty huge shift in the way that the United States is viewing Ukraine's prospects on the ground. I mean, we just had a couple weeks ago the Pentagon comment on Bakhmut and say things like, oh, well, if Bakhmut falls, it's not really a big deal. Like it won't turn the tide. Ukraine will be just fine. Now they're saying don't blow it there. What do you make of this kind of back and forth? It seems like there's almost a conflict in the mind, in the mentality, and in the overall framework that the U.S. is pursuing in Ukraine and kind of projecting onto the conflict. What's your take on what's been going on with this spring counteroffensive and all of the rhetoric around it?
Well, it's interesting you talk about a conflict within the collective mind of, say, the Washington or in the Pentagon. And Alexander Mercouris of the Duran, he often says that it does really seem like there's an intense debate about what should be done with Ukraine. So they're trying to defend Bakhmut. And I was just reading an article from the New York Times talking about the way they're burning through ammunition to defend Bakhmut may jeopardize any chance of carrying out a successful spring offensive. And just as you say, it's a last-ditch effort because they've already run, they were giving Ukraine every artillery round that they could spare, and they were keeping on hand stockpiles for their own use, for contingencies, for training for the US, for Europe. And now they're starting to utilize those stockpiles. Once those stockpiles, you could only do that one time, and that's what I believe they're doing. They're shipping large amounts of ammunition to Ukraine right now, specifically for this offensive. And once they're done doing that, they're going to have to depend only on what they can make per month, which is not much and won't be for years to come. So that's what they mean by last-ditch effort. And I'm sure Russian intelligence is well aware of this influx of artillery ammunition, how they're going to try to use it for the upcoming offensive, and they're preparing for it. And I just want to point out that they did something very similar ahead of the Kharkov and Kherson offensives. Russia, what did Russia do? Instead of allowing their troops to be destroyed, encircled, destroyed, their equipment destroyed, they withdrew. They gave that territory to Ukraine, but at a steep cost for Ukraine. They lost brigades worth of men and machines, essentially an army's worth of men and machines. And then they themselves preserved their combat power. Then they brought in 350,000 reservists and additional equipment. Then they started building defensive lines, physical defenses, where they imagine Ukraine will launch this spring offensive. And so it's going to be even worse for Ukraine come this offensive. They will lose even more. They will lose an army's worth if they decide to launch this offensive. And even if they make progress, there'll be nothing left of their military afterwards, just like after the last offensives. And the West is now unable to replace those losses. That this is the last roll of the dice, so to speak. And they're doing this with human lives. And we see the losses in Bakhmut. It's so bad that the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Kiev Independent is even writing about how they're outgunned. Russia has more guns, more ammunition. And then in addition to that, Russia is just simply outfighting them because of all of the advantages that they have on Ukraine's side. And I've heard this from multiple sources. The troops, the Ukrainian troops that NATO trained over the last 8 or 9 years, they're all gone. They're gone. And what they're doing right now is they're giving crash courses to these soldiers. I don't know what background they have, but I do know that they don't normally drive Leopard tanks or Challenger tanks or Strikers or all of these new armored vehicles they're transferring over. So they're getting a crash course on this, and then they're going to be sent in a make it or break it offensive. It's completely insane. It's desperation, dangerous desperation.
I mean, with this dangerous desperation, it feels like that what the New York Times and Washington Post, and they're doing this through the Pentagon. They're kind of just relaying, as embedded journalism as they are, kind of just relaying the message from the Pentagon. If this truly is a last-ditch effort, last ditch seems to indicate that this is it. But what is it? Like, what would be such an outcome? Like, what do you think that the Pentagon is thinking here after Bakhmut? Even if this counteroffensive has some success, whatever that would mean, it's probably going to lead to even more immense losses. And they're still underestimating this death count when it comes to Ukraine's military. But what is it then? What is this last-ditch effort, and this will be it after the counteroffensive if Ukraine doesn't play its cards right? Because there's nothing showing, at least in terms of evidence, that Ukraine, even if it has some success, will be able to fight the way that the United States wants. It seems like they're saying, we're going to give you what we have left to give you, especially in artillery, but if you use it in the way you've been using it, that will be it. It doesn't matter what the outcome is. There's nothing left from here. What do you think they mean by that?
I mean, Ukraine has these constraints placed on them on how they have to launch their offensive. They cannot do it the way Russia is doing it. Russia is doing it in this very meticulous, incremental way. And this is what's minimizing Russian losses and maximizing Ukrainian losses. They're able to do that because of the material resources they have available in terms of weapons and ammunition, and also trained manpower. Ukraine doesn't have this luxury, so they're forced to do this maneuver warfare that NATO is so keen on. But that we're finding out, when you do that against a well-armed, well-prepared enemy, you're going to lose you may take territory because you may force the Russians back, but not because you've destroyed their forces, but because they want to conserve their forces. But at the same time, you will lose your army in the process. So what will they accomplish? Let's just imagine they've taken the entire Donbas region and all of Crimea, which I think we could all agree is extremely unlikely. Russian forces are probably not going to sit there and fight to the death. They're going to withdraw like they always have. They're going to conserve their resources, their military resources. And after Ukraine has spent this last army that NATO can possibly give them, what is Russia going to do? They're going to roll back over them. And we already see some of the gains by Ukraine in the Kharkov offensive being rolled back. And this is exactly it's just going to be worse and worse. The more Ukraine spends in terms of equipment and trained manpower, the worse it's going to be when Russia decides to make its move.
Yeah. I mean, that's what's so interesting here too, is that, and we're going to get to the other parts of the world that are maybe taking things a little more seriously and doing things differently. Before we do that, definitely, if this transpires in the way that I think the Pentagon and the collective West is seeing it potentially transpiring, counteroffensive happens, huge losses. They might run out of whatever they're given. I know that there's a lot of talks now on the European side too, of like just lock and load whatever we have left, just like pump it into Ukraine, especially in artillery, and hope for the best. But there's a debate. I mean, it's not happening. Like, it's not like a snap of the finger. And the United States is having a similar mindset. Is there's a bit of truth being revealed around this, which seems to indicate that there's not a lot of confidence. Well, what do you think about the issue of peace then? The issue of like stopping or trying to come to a negotiated settlement, in NATO and the US being a party to it, because since the beginning I've said they're never going to do it. But what happens when they're backed into a corner on this issue? It seems like we've been witnessing a months-long process where the United States and the collective West have been backing themselves into that corner.
Well, it's like everything that the United States has been doing since the end of World War II. I mean, this is in pursuit of hegemony at the expense of other nations' sovereignty. What they're doing in Ukraine is all about encircling, containing, dividing, and destroying the Russian Federation. It's very clear. And that's a bookend on what they're trying to do with China on the other side of the planet. Just like with the Vietnam War, the United States was doing that in pursuit of encircling and containing China, and they just weren't able to. And then everything fell apart, and they were forced to accept the reality on the ground that Vietnam was going to be a whole and sovereign nation, and that their influence in the region was going to diminish. And I think that's how it's going to unfold for Ukraine and the U.S. presence in and around Ukraine. And it's going to be imposed on Washington that you have to create the conditions on the ground in Ukraine to force the United States out, because they will never elect to go for peace when it's a proxy war. The whole point of a proxy war is to fight with somebody else's blood, treasure, their infrastructure, their nation. It's expendable to the United States. As long as they're not paying a price for this, they have no motivation to stop. So you have to settle it on the battlefield. I really believe that that's going to have to be how it works, just as it was with the U.S. proxy war in Syria. That was another one that dragged on for years and years, and people were talking about we need negotiations, but it was clear that would have to be settled on the battlefield as well. The physical conditions, forcing the U.S. to abandon its proxy war, or at least freeze it. That's what happened in Syria. That's what's going to happen in Ukraine.
Yeah, and I think one of the important things, and maybe last word on Ukraine before we move on, because there's so much happening worldwide to get to, but maybe last word on this. Your Syria comparison, I think, is pretty apt, because Syria, while the conflict did, as you said, freeze, and there was a huge shift in the sense that Syrian government was preserved. Russia made huge contributions to that. And yet, as you said, you called it a freeze. And I think that's a good word, because the United States has continued that war by other means, through occupation, through sanctions. And I just don't see any other outcome being true in the Ukraine conflict too. I could never imagine the United States and its collective West vassals kind of counting their losses and saying, well, better luck next time. I just don't see that. I see them continuing in some form, no matter how the battlefield situation looks. This agenda, like, they're going to continue this overall policy agenda that you outlined.
When you look at the situation in Syria, you just look at what's happening now with what China is doing, brokering peace between Saudi Arabia and Iran, possibly ending the conflict in Yemen, which was essentially a sort of proxy war as well. Turkey and Syria and Russia and Iran and possibly others all talking. This is all a possibility now. And this is what's going to eventually, again, the U.S. is still occupying eastern Syria, but what they're finding is the entire region is changing around them politically and also on the ground. It's eventually going to be untenable to maintain their presence there. And just like you say, that is exactly what has to happen in Ukraine. The conditions have to be created to where this proxy war is just physically, economically, militarily impossible for the U.S. to continue waging, because they have no incentive not to. And this isn't better luck next time, because they know the window of opportunity is closing. China is surpassing the collective West. Russia has reemerged clearly. This is it. They either succeed now or it's over. These aspirations of a unipolar international, rules-based order, that's all gone, and they know that, and they're racing against the clock.
Indeed. So there's a lot of, I think, diplomatic achievements, developments that have happened involving China, and for the sake of, I think, organization, let's kind of break them up. So let's start with what's about to happen. And it comes in the context of China's position paper, its peace position on peace, and its proposal for what it believes is necessary negotiated settlement. Its 12-point proposal that happened at the 1-year anniversary of the conflict. Then you now have, after a series of meetings in Russia between Wang Yi, top diplomat, and Russian officials, you also had Qin Gang there as well in Moscow, meeting with Sergei Lavrov. Now you have Putin and Xi, Vladimir Putin, president of Russia, Xi Jinping, president of China. Xi Jinping is going to go to Moscow, meet with Putin, and it's coming in the context of a lot of developments that have transpired involving China and China's leadership, from Munich, China, Iran, Saudi Arabia deal. Let's break them up a bit. Let's talk first about the upcoming Xi and Putin meeting that's about to happen in Moscow. What are your thoughts about it? What are how have you been following this development? Just your overall reaction.
Well, it's interesting because you'll still hear a lot of people in the West, and I honestly don't know what's going on inside their head, who think that somehow China is some kind of impartial observer and they're not involved in any of this, and they're just maybe they're being cynical and taking advantage, or maybe they just want to play peacemaker. But China is fully aware that after Russia, they're next. As a matter of fact, it's not even after Russia, they're next. It's already taking place. It's been taking place for years and years. The U.S. has waged proxy war on China in a multitude of ways, including killing Chinese people all around the globe with U.S. proxies. So they know that their self-preservation is tied to Russia's success in Ukraine, and they're going to see that through. And they're doing it very carefully because they really do believe in the idea of upholding international law, not just norms and rules, but the law. And so they want to be very careful about that because they know it's a slippery slope. Once you undermine it once you make an exception once, then you're tempted to do it again and again. So they want to do it very carefully, and they are. But the United States is not leaving either Russia or China any other possible alternative to do this. They are so bent on getting both Russia and China they really have no choice but to work together against this. And as I've had Mark Sloboda and Carl Zah on my channel, and they've talked about the current ties between Russia and China and the history of Russia and China. And they actually have a lot in common. This isn't just about working together against a common threat. They already have so many reasons to be working together. This is just added on top of all of that. And I think people really underestimate how close and how much is involved in this alliance, and it spans everything from culture to history to economics to now possibly military cooperation. So this upcoming meeting, I checked RT because it's Russian media, and they talked about something of a military nature being discussed. We don't know what, but something's going on there. I think we just have to wait and see. We could see that both Russia and China, they are patient. They, again, just like on the battlefield, they're patient, they're methodical, they're doing things incrementally. They're not in a big rush. I think they realize time is on their side. It's the U.S. that is rushing through all of this and I would say making mistakes.
Yeah. I mean, can't disagree with that. And I think too, to stay on this China in Russia with regard to Ukraine, what are your thoughts about how China has gone about this? Because they propose what is really a call for parties to cease hostilities, begin to negotiate a peace settlement, and begin to take each other's interests seriously. And so I think one thing that it stood out about China's neutrality is that from day one, it stood by Russia's legitimate concerns and has never dropped them, meaning that, you know, if any country does that, then they are in fact in contradistinction to what the United States and the collective West is doing when it comes to diplomacy, and ultimately when it just comes to this conflict. But you also have Xi Jinping. This is a pretty big statement. This is going to be the first foreign visit that Xi Jinping makes since the COVID-19 pandemic, and with a world leader. And it's going to be Vladimir Putin. And it also comes after this peace proposal was publicized by the Foreign Ministry of China. You had Zelensky saying, I'm going to meet with Xi Jinping about this. And now you have China and Xi Jinping saying, well, okay, we'll have a phone call with you after our meeting with Putin. I mean, what do you think about these developments? Because I think that it really does show where China stands. China is very good about adhering to, rhetorically and in its actions, as you said earlier, the UN Charter National Law. But obviously, China is also navigating what is a conflict, what is this great power confrontation developing, led by the United States. It's navigating all of that, which, of course, is in contradistinction to international law. So you see China moving in this way. How have you seen, like, what's your opinion about this? I thought that was one of the most interesting developments. Zelensky publicizing, and we're going to meet, the media going crazy about it. Oh, Zelensky's going to be with Xi. It's amazing. And then, of course, no, actually, Xi Jinping's going to meet in person with Putin and perhaps have a phone call, video call with Zelensky at some point afterward.
Again, I think China is well aware that this is a proxy war and that no decision is being made in Kiev except maybe the lighting in Zelensky's studio. I think that's about it. And what would the purpose of going to go meet Zelensky, or Zelensky going to go meet the leadership of China? It would only play into what the U.S. is doing. So I think they're well aware of that. They understand that there's many different dimensions to this because of different points of view. You know, the Western public, a lot of the Western public is still buying into this narrative that this is a Russian war of aggression against a victimized, innocent Ukraine. And they understand the idea of international law, but they also understand that this is a proxy war waged against Russia that is ultimately part of the proxy war being waged against China. And it's self-preservation has to come first. And they're trying to be as careful as possible about preserving their existence while also trying to meet all of their obligations under international law, because they're thinking into the future. We see the US and Europe burning all of their bridges now, cashing in all of their chips right now. Russia and China are trying to think into the future. Once this is over, everyone's got to cooperate again. And we're going to want to do that in a framework governed by international law. So they're doing all of these different things, and they're trying to navigate all of it. But I think self-preservation is going to is going to be the priority.
I know we can't see into the minds of Xi Jinping and Putin, and we can't predict what will happen. Do you think there's any chance that out of this meeting comes a concrete proposal of action steps to begin a peace process around the Ukraine conflict?
But even for Russia, they've never ruled out negotiations. They were attempting to negotiate with Ukraine since the very beginning of the special military operation, and all along they're open to the possibility. And I think that's part of what China is doing also. They want to keep this door open. Just they know that the United States is never going to take advantage of it, but it will be there so that at the very end, when this is all finally resolved, however it's resolved, both Russia and China can say that all along we said we were open to negotiations. All along we had this peace plan, and you are the one that decided not to take advantage of it. And when you look back at all of the different proposals going all the way back to the Minsk agreement, Ukraine had every possibility from the very beginning, even after the U.S. interfered in their internal political affairs, to maintain the complete territorial integrity of what Kiev considers Ukraine, and they decided not to. And it's just going to get worse and worse and worse each time they slap the hand of negotiation away and they choose to continue this proxy war.
Yeah, indeed. So now I'd like to talk about what's happened in between this development, like as we lead up to the Xi Putin meeting, and as China has inserted itself, commenting on the 1-year anniversary of the conflict with its position paper for peace. And of course, the big news around this is the Saudi Arabia-Iran agreement that was brokered in Beijing. It's been downplayed in the Western mainstream media, hasn't gotten much attention beyond the day that it occurred. There's been some back and forth about the potential consequences of this. How do you see this? I think it seems pretty monumental, and it certainly is not without context. What do you think people need to know about this?
I think people should understand that I believe that Saudi Arabia has been more of a hostage of the United States than an ally for the longest time. Maybe there was a certain period of time where Saudi Arabia was getting some kind of benefit from this relationship with Washington, through the petrodollar and everything, but that has long since passed. And increasingly, as the U.S. empire is in decline, they're going to try to seek to get their vassals to pay the price first before they have to pay the price for their declining empire. And so you saw them putting pressure on Saudi Arabia to launch these proxy wars against Syria, against Yemen, against Iran through Yemen in many ways, and to maintain this animosity between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And a lot of people like to believe that this is about religion because they're two different sects of Islam. But in reality, if you look at some place like Syria, all of these different groups of Muslims can get along. They can fight together shoulder to shoulder. That's how past these differences they can go. And so this was entirely artificial. And in many ways, because the U.S., its economy depends on the petrodollar, they were surrounding Saudi Arabia with hostility, an unstable environment where Saudi Arabia needed to maintain this relationship with the United States for its own self-preservation. And I think they've sought a way out from under this oppressive shadow the U.S. casts over them in the entire region. And I think both Russia and China have offered them that exit, and they've taken it. And they've been doing this over a long period of time. I think if people were following this, they would see news stories spanning years. Yeah. Everyone getting ready for this transition, including Iran. Iran has been very patient. Why were they patient? Because I think they could see light at the end of the tunnel. And so now here we are. And again, the entire region is being transformed and stabilized to make this possible. And we have to say that now things are looking much more stable than they were in 2011 for sure, or all the way back to 2003 when the U.S. invaded Iraq, and that is what's happening. And then what impact does this have on, say, the petrodollar? I think it's huge. I think just even kind of hard to tell how this is even going to play out, but it's major because now Saudi Arabia is going to be dealing with Russia, with China, and many other nations that are. You see, the U.S. is sanctioning everyone and trying to isolate everyone, and in reality, they're isolating themselves. And this is going to blow up in their face, just like the EU and their sanctions against Russia.
Yeah, and the significance of China being the center of perhaps one of the most consequential for the region and the world of diplomatic achievements over the last generation. I mean that seems to be a huge kind of elephant in the room that the United States and the collective West don't want to deal with. To have Saudi Arabia in particular, it's not so surprising that Iran would lean on China to help broker such a deal. But for Saudi Arabia to make this decision comes on the heels of a lot of developments, Brian. The China-Arab Summit late in 2022, and of course, Saudi Arabia's interest in joining the BRICS Plus mechanism. What's your take on not just how Saudi Arabia has kind of moved especially since the Ukraine conflict, politically in aligning itself in a more open manner to multipolarism, but also China being at the center of all of this. I mean, really, it's kind of the elephant in the room that the collective West likes to avert their attention from.
It's a really good point because the West is acting as if this is some kind of anomaly. How is China taking over this role from the United States? But when you think about it, China has the largest population in the world. It has either already does or will soon have the largest economy, one of the largest militaries. Geographically, it's very large. It has its own wealth of resources. And then on top of it all, it is the largest trading partner of virtually every country on Earth. It has the largest industrial base by far. I forget how many times larger than the US it is, but it's much larger. And so it only makes sense that, say, Saudi Arabia, who's their largest trading partner? I almost guarantee that it would be China. And that's the case for so many nations. And in the few instances where that isn't the case, I would say that's the anomaly. And so it makes perfect sense for China to surpass not just the US, but the collective West. In terms of just look at the percentage of the global population the US constitutes. Does it even make any sense that they're the global leaders? The answer is no. It makes sense that China would be playing this role because they are the largest and they are the most influential and they have the most practical means to change the situation in any given country. We see this through their Belt and Road Initiative. They build things, in essence. They don't just play games with words and numbers on ledgers like the U.S. has increasingly done over the decades. They still have a real economy, and people want to connect to it. So it makes perfect sense that Saudi Arabia is making this pivot. It would have happened anyway, but the U.S. is accelerating it because it really has become a hostage situation between not just Saudi Arabia and the U.S., but so many nations that consider the U.S. an ally. Or not. Oh, look at Germany, for example. I mean, talk about a hostage situation. They literally blew up that pipeline to prevent Germany from getting out from under U.S. subordination, basically.
Indeed. Yeah. And, I think what's so interesting here too is that China talks a lot about even on that point alone, population wise. So when China has a lot about democratizing international relations, democratizing the way that the world order operates in terms of everything from diplomacy, conflict, all of it, to democratize it, economics. Do you think that's what China was able? Do you think China was embodying that through this Iran Saudi Arabia deal? Because on the point alone that you made about population and just what role China should be playing on the world stage is very, I think, accurate. But then you add into how China is actually behaving as a world leader. And I've called it leading by example rather than leading by imposition.
It's a really good point. And a lot of people worry that China is just going to replace the United States as the next overbearing and aggressive hegemon. But I don't think so, because look at how China is on the rise. It's not on the rise by invading other countries, stripping them of their natural resources, dictating to people how to run their own internal affairs in their own country. It's the exact opposite. They go into a country, they're doing business, and then they're also building infrastructure. And when you build physical infrastructure in another country, you are giving them the ability to generate more wealth, to have more power. And what you see is a balancing of power around the globe that had been concentrated deliberately so in the hands of the West. And they did that by deliberately not building infrastructure. I remember going through Laos, and I'll tell this story a million times because it's a perfect example of how this whole process has taken place. When I went through Laos, I saw Chinese companies building their first major highways. And then after that, they were building the high-speed railway. And before that, they had just these tiny winding roads going through these mountain passes. It was horrible. It took 4 days to go from Kunming to Vientiane, the capital of Laos. Didn't have any trains at all. And then you go to the capital, Vientiane, and you see all of these Western NGOs. And what they do is they go around the capital, which at that time still had dirt roads, and they were hanging banners telling the people there, don't use too much electricity. So that is their mentality, is to keep these countries impoverished, to keep them down, to divide them against each other internally and against their neighbors regionally. And that is the way the United States, being a minority among the global population, can maintain control over everyone else. Because if everyone else was developing normally, the United States would simply have no way to impose itself on them. China's not interested in that. I'm here in Thailand. Thailand's largest trade partner is China. Second largest trade partner is the United States. Only the U.S. is meddling in Thailand's internal political affairs, putting violent mobs in the streets, telling Thailand how to run their foreign policy. That's the U.S. That is not China. And that's not how they're doing business anywhere. And then maybe I'm kind of rambling here, but also the Chinese military, the way that it's growing, it's an immense country. It should have a correspondingly immense military. But the way that military is being developed is to defend Chinese territory, not project military power around the globe. And it's funny because if you read U.S. policy papers about any sort of upcoming conflict with China, they're quite happy about the fact that China really doesn't have the ability to project military power around the globe like the United States can. And that tells you a lot about the mentality in Beijing and what their motivations are and the type of system they are trying to set up or influence.
Yeah, and I think it's a good time to talk about the latest escalations of the United States and the collective West toward China here, because, you're saying that China is not interested in conflict, is interested in cooperation, is showing it on the world stage. Yet you had recently the AUKUS alliance, which in 2021 was formed between the United States, Australia, the UK, and there was a commitment to develop, especially Australia's capacity in terms of nuclear submarines. Now the United States is gearing to finally give, it's 2023 now, finally give Virginia-class submarines to Australia to begin the process of developing. This is going to be an incredibly expensive endeavor for Australia. They're going to massively expand their military budget, already have been, to counter the so-called China threat. But still, years down the road, it seems like, for these nuclear submarines to ever be, first of all, developed by Australia and then deployed in any kind of meaningful way. What do you make of this development? Because China, of course, is furious. A lot of Indonesia also made a statement saying, this is absolutely opposed to the principles of non-nuclear proliferation. What is your take on this latest escalation and where it fits within this row that the U.S. and the collective West have been building up with China?
It's more of exactly the same. This is what the US does everywhere. So they're using Ukraine as a proxy against Russia. They're obviously cultivating separatism in the island province of Taiwan to use that against the rest of China. And they're also in Australia, and they're cultivating Australia as a armed, belligerent proxy against China. And again, when you look at who China's largest, most important trade partner is, by far is China. The United States will never be able to serve as an alternative for the economic connections and opportunities China offers Australia. So who is the United States arming Australia to fight against? Their largest trade partner. Why would China disrupt that militarily when they're benefiting so much from this relationship in terms of economics? And then Indonesia and other nations in the region, they understand that most of their trade is taking place in Asia. And so if the United States manages to create some sort of conflict or even tensions and destabilizing the region, that's going to affect the economy of every single nation in the region. And again, that is the goal the United States has. It's not just China surpassing the US, it's all of Asia rising and surpassing the whole of the West. So they're interested in destabilizing and leveling to the ground all of Asia, if they can get away with it. And apparently Australia is very eager to do this. I mean, there are former politicians, there are political activists in Australia fighting against this, but of course we all are aware of the momentum and the scale of the propaganda machines operating all across the West, and Australia is no exception.
Yeah, and it is really, when Australia maybe has been, even prior to what's been going on in Ukraine, a real prototype for what's been happening to the collective West under U.S. dominion, which is being constantly pushed and honestly embracing. I mean, there's very little pushback in Australia's political system around this. There's been a wide embrace of this growing conflict with China. And it feels like a mirror to the EU almost, where the EU has, despite however much sanctions on Russia really do go against the EU's economic interests, still doing it and still embracing it in principle and based on their so-called morals. Australia has done the same thing.
Absolutely. I mean, that's the point to make, that this isn't uncharted territory where Australia is headed. And I think their economy has already suffered because of this irrational belligerence that they are adopting against China. They already have, but the EU is taking it to the extreme, and they're showing Australia where their future lies. But also, I think Ukraine is kind of giving a little glimpse into the future of how far this can go if Australia allows it. And the problem is, and Caitlin Johnstone wrote a really good article in Consortium News about this, about how Australia essentially fears the United States more than, if obviously doesn't fear China at all. They're not worried about China. They're worried about the United States because nothing that they're doing serves their best interests by going along with the U.S. They're quite well, it's hard to say, because when you listen to some of these Australian politicians talk, they seem very eager to go along with this. But there would be consequences if anyone came along and tried to oppose this. And again, just look at Germany. The U.S. was placing sanctions on German and other European companies involved in the Nord Stream 2 construction, and the U.S. went as far as literally blowing the pipeline up to stop that. What would they do to Australia? How far would they go with Australia to ensure that it went down this path of playing proxy for the U.S. against China? It's scary to even think.
Yeah, and I mean, talking about scary here, it's both, you know, in this realm of building up this conflict directly between the collective West and China, and the U.S. is certainly leading the way. But then you have this very much so a proxy war the United States is developing with regard to Taiwan. And Taiwan now is supposedly in this, as you've covered so many times, what the United States pledges, what the collective West pledges, and what it actually does are two different things. But nonetheless, it has been pledged that Taiwan will eventually get missiles for F-16 fighter jets. And that comes off of a $600 million plus military aid package to Taiwan. Yet another, infusion of what has been a years-long process of militarizing the island. What's your reaction to that? I mean, it seems like, I mean, they were almost publicly bragging about it while they were coming to that agreement.
It's hard to tell where any sort of geopolitical utility ends and military profiteering begins, because even U.S. Think tanks, their policy papers about any sort of potential conflict between Taiwan and the rest of China note that the Taiwanese Air Force would be destroyed in the opening phase. It would play no role at all whatsoever. So what are these missiles going to be doing? But besides making the fires bigger, that's all they're going to be doing. So this is a huge transfer of wealth from American taxpayers, people in Taiwan paying taxes, transferring money from them to Lockheed Martin or Raytheon or whoever's making these particular missiles. So there's that. But also, again, read their policy papers. The U.S. doesn't make a secret of this. They admit that if at this point it's already too late, there's absolutely no way that separatists on Taiwan could fight the rest of China and somehow come out on top. It's impossible. Even if the United States intervened immediately, the entire island would be scoured clean of infrastructure, industry, and any semblance of normal life for the civilian population. The United States even has talked about, well, if it looks like the People's Liberation Army is going to get a hold of this port or that airport or this semiconductor factory, we'll just shoot missiles at it and destroy it ourselves. So they plan to completely sacrifice all of Taiwan. And why are they doing this? And we've talked about this before. Taiwan is on the path to inevitable, peaceful, mutually beneficial reunification with the rest of China. The U.S. knows this. They know time is on China's side. They know China's in no rush to do this. So they have a window of opportunity of spoiling that and making Beijing pay the highest price possible for that, and possibly precipitating a conflict where the U.S. believes maybe, our economy is completely toast. Maybe we can destroy their economy too, and then it'll be a race to see who can reassert themselves first. Because the status quo being as it is, China will most certainly surpass the U.S.
And as you said, Brian, I believe it was the CSIS military war simulation.
Yes.
It was very outright open about how Taiwan indeed would end up becoming an essentially a completely and utterly destroyed territory, which would leave the people there literally starving. I believe that's what was being referenced, is that people would starve, and it would be a huge humanitarian catastrophe, and likely they were what you could hearken to is like a Yemen situation, right? The U.S. provide all that support for a war in Yemen, and it's become the worst humanitarian catastrophe. That's what awaits Taiwan, and they've already been kind of leading up to that too, Brian, because of the way that the U.S. has been dealing with China economically. So they have been targeting Taiwan's large semiconductor industry and trying to woo Taiwan to basically latch itself to the United States and cut itself off from China, which is in and of itself incredibly not only costly, but likely suicidal on the economic front. And then politically, we've seen changes happen on Taiwan with its regional government, semi-autonomous government. What's your, I guess, where do you feel like all that fits into this, what you were just speaking about?
Well, it's good that you brought that up. It would be economic suicide for Taiwan to cut itself off from the rest of China. If you look at their trade, half of its exports go to the rest of China, and a lot of crucial imports essential for its semiconductor and electrical component industry come from the rest of China. So that would just be suicide, and there's no way the U.S. could compensate for that. It's impossible. And just look on a map, the proximity of the island of Taiwan to the rest of China and its proximity to the United States. It's utterly absurd, which is why nothing about this makes sense. But then if you look at that CSIS war game, and they're talking about the preservation of Taiwan political autonomy, which in itself is an illusion. There is no political autonomy without constant U.S. political and military support. The separatists on Taiwan would not exist. They would have disappeared decades ago. They would have been completely erased, and Taiwan would be integrated into the rest of China already. So they're talking about preserving the illusion of political autonomy in exchange for Taiwan's physical existence. It's unbelievable, but this is where the U.S. is. This is how desperate they are. And I talk about a closing window of opportunity, but it seems in many ways that the window has already closed. And this is just one last desperate gasp that they're going for, just to raise the price as high as possible for China.
Yeah, and it feels like what we're witnessing here is, and you've covered this and I've covered this, is that there's just this inability to kind of pull back. And people ask a lot, and I guess I'll throw it to you. Will there be a war between the US and China? I mean, right now you have the US getting really close to a war with Russia. I mean, it's much closer than it's ever maybe has been, even if we looked at the Cold War. Soviet Union and the US came many times close to a direct war. But given the way that war has changed, this is probably as close as it gets without a direct confrontation. Do you feel like, a lot of people ask me, do you feel like that's going to happen here? And my answer is, well, everything is being laid out for such a thing to occur. We just don't know when. What is your take?
It's obvious the United States is preparing for a war with China. They're doing everything they can to prepare their population. It's almost, you could almost sense the desperation and the rush to do this among a U.S. leadership class to do this. So it almost seems certainly they're going to try. And I think what China's going to do is do everything possible to avoid a war. They don't want a war with the United States. They know time is on their side. And if they could avoid it, they will. But again, this goes back to the situation in Ukraine. You have to create the physical conditions that make it physically impossible for the U.S. to do this, which is very hard. I mean, there's a lot of factors that play in China's to its benefit. The fact that they are on the other side of the ocean. The U.S. has to go on the other side of the Pacific Ocean to pick this fight with China, essentially. And the political landscape on Taiwan is changing. I don't know if it'll change fast enough, but it's changing in a sense where it would be very hard for the U.S. to point to Taiwan and say, this is our justification for war. When the last local election, they rejected the separatist Democratic Progressive Party. So if that keeps going in that direction, then who knows? But then again, like I said, this is the end of the road for U.S. hegemony. And when they're this desperate, they're extremely dangerous and unpredictable. So it's almost impossible to tell how far they will go. When you really think about it, when was the last time a non-white nation surpassed the entire West? And just think about the mindset of these people in Washington, London, and Brussels. Joseph Borrell calling the rest of the world a jungle. Do you think people like this are they're physically, tactically, strategically unable to win this, but psychologically they're unable to lose it? And so where does that leave us? A very dangerous. So that's why we're doing what we're doing. We're trying to raise awareness about this issue as much as possible. The more people globally, ordinary people globally, that understand what is actually really going on, the harder it's going to be for the US and Europe to just go ahead and do this. And they might, but they will be doing it with a population that is very cognizant of what they're doing and why. It's going to be harder to trick them, hopefully.
Yeah, I think we can now get to some super chat questions. We had a few,
Sure.
and so um, we have Felix. Thanks, Felix, asking Brian, approximately how many of the 370,000 Russian reservists and volunteers mobilized in September and during the partial mobilization are currently on the battlefield? Any?
I think they've been moved into the theater of operation, but I don't think they've been committed to the fighting. Not the majority of them, and this is even what some Western analysts have been saying. Western pro-Ukrainian analysts have said the majority of this mobilized force has not been committed anywhere yet, which again, that goes back to what Ukraine is doing. They're struggling to hold Bakhmut against a private military company. And there's just this gargantuan reservist force that's been training all of this time that hasn't even really factored into the fighting yet. So when they do, what is that going to do? And it's probably going to parry the Ukrainian offensive, and then that'll be the fighting capacity of Ukraine collapsing, and then this large force will be able to make its move.
Yeah, it'll be really interesting what Russia's move will be then, because you're essentially saying everything will have changed. I mean, that's just not how the battlefield looks at the moment, but it's definitely a real possibility that it will look like that in the very near future. A different perspective asked, do you think Putin Yi, I don't know if they meant Putin Xi, but it doesn't really matter because Wang Yi, who is the top foreign policy diplomat in China, would likely be announcing any such a thing anyway. Do you think that there will be a military alliance between Russia and China announced? Probably likely they're reacting to the meeting between Putin and Xi Jinping.
Well, there might be military cooperation announced, which is different than a military alliance. I think China and Russia are trying to avoid just mirroring what the United States and its allies do. And military cooperation is something that is temporary, subjective to whatever is going on at the time, and then it could be rolled back. It's very flexible. It gives them a lot of options, which is something Russia and China like to do, whereas the West likes to apparently paint themselves into corners.
Indeed. I just want to acknowledge Moondragon here. We did address this in the beginning, and you can always catch the replay in the beginning, but I want to acknowledge your question, and thank you so much. There is, I think, one more question, though, and I think it's a good one. Let me scroll down. Let me see. I want to pull it up on the screen. Where is it? Chat is going fast. The chat is going so fast, it's hard to pull it up on the screen. Let's see. Here we go. So this is from, not going to try that name, but Kaifir. General question to both of you. Someone living in the West with no way to get out of there. Any suggestions on how to weather this? Now, I don't know what exactly this is, but I'm going to assume that what you're saying is weathering the storm of, I guess, what we're talking about here, which is this growing danger and threat of, well, the danger is kind of here, these conflicts, these wars that the U.S. and the collective West are engaging in. But how do you react to this question? How do we weather this storm?
I made the decision to get out of the West specifically because, even like 20 years ago, this was all obviously where it was all headed, and I got out. So, I mean, that's what you would probably want to do. Go to some country that has some sort of sane, foreign and domestic policy where it doesn't have to be perfect, but people should generally be coming first. The self-preservation of the country should be coming first. But if you're stuck in the West, just think about the collapse of the Soviet Union. I mean, there were places where things were relatively okay, and then there were other places where there was a lot of, violence, instability. Probably you'd want to avoid big cities. Being in a big city, you'd want to be in a community where there was a sense of community, because people are people everywhere you go, and most ordinary people are decent, and if they know each other, they'll work together and help each other out. And I mean, that's just been my experience here in Asia, and I think it will still hold true in the West. And I think the West will weather this. I think there will be a collapse. The circles of power right now running things, they have created an unsustainable system that will collapse, and something else will take its place. Hopefully, people who are a little bit who want to have a more constructive and reasonable role on the global stage and work. I always say this: work among all other nations rather than trying to impose themselves upon all other nations. It will happen. It will take time, but yes, I would say just try to get away. If anything, just try to get away from big cities if you can.
Yeah, I mean,
Sorry,
I
Danny.
feel that. No, I know. Like I'm out in the United States in a big city, and it no, truly, what you're speaking about is something I feel every day. It's just, in response to this question, it is very difficult to, to navigate these very. I mean, I think the most frustrating thing is not so much what the U.S. is doing and what the collective West is doing. That's kind of to be expected, and I feel like for both of us, we've been covering this for years, and we know that as it exists today, this is how this unipolar world system led by the United States, this is how it behaves. But at the same time, I think what's frustrating about being in, let's say, the United States or somewhere in the collective West, I'm sure there's similar feelings here, is that there's just not a lot of pushback. Not a lot of pushback. There are good people doing good stuff. I know there's a rally today in Washington, D.C., just shortly after this stream. There was one in February as well. Those things happen, but they're too far and few in between. So how do we weather this? So if you do happen to be in this part of the world, I think whether doing your part to talk about this, to get it out there, to get the information out there, and also to engage with people who are also interested in doing the same thing, and making sure that this is not something that's just brushed aside and isn't made an issue for ordinary people. It has to be. It's not disconnected. I mean, everything that we talk about here definitely takes away from the livelihoods and the well-being of people in the United States and people in the collective West. It does make a huge difference, whether it's the EU sanctions, the energy crisis that has happened in the EU. We're now seeing economic collapse to some degree in the United States, the rampant inflation. Now you have banks closing and murmurs of possibly another 2008-like crisis previewing and emerging. So this endless stream of wars and more wars and building up geopolitical crises does have a real impact on people. And it's hard for people, I think, to see that directly when they are just awash in the propaganda.
Well, one thing I would say, and I hesitate to tell people the hope because I generally find that hope is the first step on the road to disappointment. But I would say that I don't think you're going to watch other nations come in like vultures and pick the bones clean of the United States the way the US, the British, and other European nations attempted to do to the Soviet Union and the nascent Russian Federation. And I think that severely compounded the crisis and the suffering of the Russian people. And I think that if the US and Europe had good intentions and had some sort of positive, constructive vision for the world, they would have helped the Russian people through that. And it would not have been nearly as bad. And maybe, just maybe, the rest of the world will see the United States, these circles of power disintegrating, and they may try to help the United States weather this faster than what would have happened if they all decided to just kick the U.S. while it was down.
I think this is a good segue into the final question from the super chats. How will a multipolar world benefit the American working class? This person is personally moving out of the United States, so I guess taking your advice, Brian. But yeah, I think this is a good question. What do you think, Brian? How would it benefit working class people here? I mean, really everywhere, but especially here in the collective West, for the world to become more democratic, more multipolar.
Well, I mean, the whole concept of multipolarism is understanding the primacy of national sovereignty, the nation state, and a nation state exists because it has a certain degree of self-sufficiency in terms of its economy, its resources, its industry. And the whole reason why the American working class are suffering right now is because the US was playing globalist. It was playing globalist where it saw the whole world to be divided up into different places to do this kind of manufacturing, that kind of manufacturing, exploiting cheap labor. And they did this at the expense of America's industrial base and obviously the American workers working within that industrial base. So hopefully with multipolarism, and I already see, say here in Thailand, the industrial base is only growing as its relationship with other nations in Southeast Asia continue to grow, and with China, it's growing, and because everyone just wants to do business. There's no one forcing someone to make some sort of arrangement that eviscerates their own industrial base, and so this is almost certainly going to help the United States. And there's so much potential. The U.S. has proven that potential in the past, and it could bring that potential back. But it could only happen in a multipolar world. That's the thing to remember. The circles of interest in power in Washington and on Wall Street right now, they're not ever going to move industry back to the U.S. That's not ever going to happen. You need multipolarism for that to happen.
Yeah, and multipolar world certainly has already brought huge benefits to those countries participating with China, with Russia, especially China, though, in terms of, you mentioned earlier, the Belt and Road Initiative and various other mechanisms for what they call integration, different than the kind of Western-led globalization model, rather than becoming subservient to the United States and the West through through any kind of economic bilateralism and multilateralism. What China is doing is saying, no, sovereignty is indeed going to be respected, but we have a lot to offer you and you have a lot to offer us. So let's work together in getting these roads paved, these bridges built, these ports up and running. Let's get electricity all across the African continent. Let's start building rail and transportation in places like Laos and Pakistan. Like, let's do these things, and we will all benefit for it. And it has happened. I mean, the World Bank admits that poverty it's not just China that's alleviating extreme poverty in China. The Belt and Road Initiative already has paid dividends and has made progress in reducing extreme poverty in the places where Belt and Road initiatives are happening. So, on that point alone, like, actually standards of living will rise in a multipolar world because China and Russia's overall approach economically will benefit more people around the world. And then, I mean, what will that do to the United States, which has not seen anything but declining living standards for decades now? There has to be somewhere where you can look where there is the possibility of the opposite happening. That's one of the big problems we have in the United States. It's not just propaganda, not knowing. It's also not believing or expecting anything different can happen. Well, if it's happening around the world, then indeed, the more likely people are going to be able to learn about it and hopefully, demand very similar what might be happening. And so that's why it's important for it to accelerate. And it's important for us to speak out and expose and talk about war and talk about how it's trying to arrest and how the United States and the collective West are trying to use war to hold it back and to hold the multipolar world back.
Yes, and again, I've watched it happen here in Southeast Asia. As Western influence wanes, that is what has allowed these nations to actually begin developing. And you can see the West still intervening specifically to artificially arrest that development. And you can see that it's China spurring it along. And Laos is it's just such an incredible transformation that it has made over the last couple of years. And that's all because China went in there and built physical infrastructure in a country where the West was hanging banners telling people don't use electricity. There's no need for infrastructure. You shouldn't even be using electricity. I mean, it's night and day, the two different visions for the world. and China's vision and the vision of multipolarism, because it's not just China's vision. Every nation aspires to preserve its sovereignty and develop to its fullest potential. That is a vision of the world we could all believe in and invest in. That's what we need to be doing.
Yes, yes, indeed. Well, Brian, it was really great for you to join me today. Stick around, everyone. I'm going to be on for another half hour or so, covering one more thing. But I wanted to just leave it to you, Brian. Thanks for coming. Anything you'd like to say before you head out?
No, just thank you for having me on. It's always great to talk with you, Danny. And that's about it. I look forward to our next conversation.
Sure. Yes. We've been doing this about monthly now, and it's been really great to collaborate with someone as yourself who's been following these things so deeply and has such a wealth of knowledge to offer. With that said, everyone, do follow Brian on the New Atlas. Go to his YouTube, go to his Telegram, and be sure to follow him, t.me. It's / the New Atlas, correct?
Well, yeah, just type in the New Atlas and
type in New Atlas, find it all the platforms. Make sure that you're connected and plugged in. Thank you again, Brian, and I will see you again soon.
Yes, thank you. Bye.
Bye. All right, everyone, stick around. I do want to cover one story with all of you. I'm going to actually plug in, though, so give me a sound check and let me know how I sound afterward, because sometimes the battery can cause some issues. So let me know how I sound as I plug in. Give me a sound check. Do stick around. I do have also an announcement. But first, I want to talk about, and now I'm plugged in, checking. Let me know. I'm going to take off these headphones. Actually, I don't need them anymore. All right, everyone. So that was a great conversation with Brian. Always great for him to come on, impart his knowledge. He's a wealth of knowledge. But now I want to talk to you about, I want to continue on this conversation about Bakhmut and about what the West is saying about Bakhmut. And before I get to the story I want to cover, though, I want to share with you how I've been researching stories like Bakhmut and various questions on the Ukraine conflict of late. Because as you know, both Brian and I, we go through a lot of mainstream Western media, right? We look at it, we research it. And I want to talk to you today about Ground News, which is an app and website that I have found to be very helpful for me in locating international world news into one place. So it aggregates all of this into one place, all of these news stories that we sift through here on the Left Lens. Ground News helps aggregate it. So it's a new app and a website that I found, and you can, see here how Ground News works. And here what you're looking at is a storyboard of news about Bakhmut on ground.news. And here you see that Ground News aggregates tells you that 817 stories have been published about Bakhmut over the last 3 months, which Ground News has aggregated. And there's some really interesting features here. One of the most interesting for me is this blind spot. So what Ground News does is it aggregates media and then organizes it based on its various biases from left, center to right. And so this is very helpful because this helps us understand, well, where is this particular story? Where is this particular source coming from? So here you have one of the biggest headlines over the last couple of weeks has been what the Pentagon has said about the fall of Bakhmut, because the collective West is getting ready for that, to Russia. And here you have the Pentagon chief. This story was widely reported by 11 sources, and the fall of Bakhmut would not turn the tide for Russia, said the Pentagon chief. And here you see that only 10% of the sources were on the left of the political spectrum, meaning that the far majority, 40% in the center, 50% on the right, have been covering this story. And that helps you understand as you start looking at these headlines here, you can start to look at the kind of language that they use. What are their sources? Where are they coming from? Right? So here you have, for example, Ukraine vows to hold on to Russia in Bakhmut despite Russian onslaught. You have 16 sources on this. So you can look at the news, right? You can go to this headline and you can see then, right, where these sources are coming from. So Business Live leans to the right. There's mixed factuality. One of the biggest things that I really like to look into is who owns these sources, right? Who owns these media channels that we rely on for information? Well, here you see a wealthy private owner owns the Times of India. You see a media conglomerate owns independent.ie. And you can actually look at the distribution of all of these sources of who owns which. So a lot of our sources are coming from big media conglomerates. A lot of them are coming from wealthy private owners, and not a lot of them are coming from independent sources. So that can help you track these biases and understand them better. So Ground News is really on a mission to bring transparency to the media that we consume and to really create a world where we can understand the differences and understand how different media approach certain issues. And in geopolitics, that's so critical. And it helps us then to stay fully informed on all sides. And one of the greatest things I think about Ground News right now is that it doesn't exclude sources. So a lot of these news aggregators outside of Ground News are talking about sources like Global Times and RT, sources that I rely on, as being not relevant, right? As not being relevant and as being things that we need to dismiss. And Ground News doesn't do that. Ground.news actually will share these sources, and you can find all of these sources right here on this aggregate. So I find on this aggregated website. So I find this source to be great. You can check it out for free or subscribe for some unlimited access at ground.news/the left lens. I am going to put that in the chat, actually. Okay. So I'm going to put ground.news/the left lens in the chat. So you can, take advantage of this resource. And okay, sorry about that. I'm going to put that in the chat right now. You can so ground.news/the left lens. Okay. So there's a link in the chat. And you can follow along with me in future streams around articles that I share, because I'm going to be sharing a lot from Ground News in future streams. And just lastly, you can get 30% off of their Vantage subscription through the link that I provided. It's also in the video description here, which means that it'll only be about $5 per month, $5.83 a month until the 26th of March. And so that gives you unlimited access to features like ownership and factuality, as well as the unlimited articles. But with that said, I want to thank actually Ground News for sponsoring this video because their resource has been immensely helpful. So with that said, everyone, I did want to cover, and I've been doing a lot of research about Bakhmut through Ground News, and now I want to cover a New York Times story. Okay. So the New York Times actually did admit, right? And I'm going to first, I'm going to pull up this New York Times article for all of you because they did admit what Brian and I were talking about. So I want to cover this story because I find it very interesting how the New York Times is speaking about Bakhmut at this moment, where you have the collective West really scrambling and trying to figure out what are they going to do when it falls, when Bakhmut falls. So a couple of weeks ago, remember, the Pentagon chief, Lloyd Austin, former Raytheon board member, what did he say? He said this isn't going to turn the tide for Russia. This isn't going to make a big difference. It'll be more symbolic than impactful. Well, only a couple weeks later, a couple days ago, this is what the New York Times is writing about. They're saying Ukraine burns through ammunition in Bakhmut, putting future fights at risk. The military is using thousands of artillery shells a day as it tries to hold the eastern city, which could jeopardize a planned springtime campaign. So it sounds like Bakhmut is actually very significant because the way that Ukraine has been fighting this war, the way the United States has equipped Ukraine to fight this war, a war of attrition, right? A war basically to the bitter end, a war of regime change against Russia, using whatever the collective West has at its disposal to enable Ukraine to do this. Of course, much to the chagrin of the collective West, it has not worked. But now you have the New York Times admitting that the way that Ukraine is fighting this and the way that the collective West is honestly fighting this, because they cannot be detached from Ukraine's military, is putting the spring offensive at risk. The spring offensive, which is now seen as a last-ditch effort for Ukraine to make any headway in this war again. So the Ukrainian military, the Times says, is firing thousands of artillery shells a day as it tries to hold on to the eastern city of Bakhmut, a pace that American and European officials say is unsustainable and could jeopardize a planned springtime campaign that they hope will prove decisive. The bombardment has been so intense that the Pentagon raised concerns with Kiev recently after several days of nonstop artillery firing, two U.S. officials said, highlighting the tension between Ukraine's decision to defend Bakhmut at all costs and its hope for retaking territory in the spring. One of those officials said the Americans warned Ukraine against wasting ammunition at a key time. With so much riding on a Ukrainian counteroffensive, the U.S. and Britain are preparing to ship thousands of NATO and Soviet-type artillery rounds and rockets to help shore up supplies for a coming offensive. But a senior American defense official described that as a last-ditch effort because Ukraine's allies do not have enough ammunition to keep up with Ukraine's pace, and their stocks are critically low. Western manufacturers are ramping up production, but it will take many months for new supplies to begin meeting demand. This is exactly what we've been saying here at the Left Lens for months and months and months since this issue of ammunition and artillery and weaponry was raised following the Kharkov offensives and the Kherson offensives, that after that moment, Ukraine essentially had burned through everything that they had, and they were well equipped to begin the conflict. Indeed, we can't underestimate that. Now they're not. And despite all the stories about Russians using toilet seats and all of this nonsense about the Wagner group, it's quite clear that Russia does not have these same problems, because if they did, you better believe the collective West's mainstream media and the U.S. media would be reporting on that and would be reporting on in detail. Always question when there are no details about accusations and allegations on Russia, but yet they can come out with stories like this about their own ally, Ukraine, supposedly, as having these problems. And now they're warning. Now you have top defense officials in the United States, in NATO, saying, warning, you keep wasting these artillery shells, you keep wasting your ammunition, and it's not going to come back. So this situation, the Times says, has put Kiev in an increasingly perilous position. Its troops are likely to have one meaningful opportunity this year to go on the offensive, push back Russian forces, and retake land that was occupied after the invasion began last year. And they will probably have to do it while contending with persistent ammunition shortages. So what does that mean? It means they won't do it. They're not going to be able to succeed here. How can they do it if they don't have the ammunition? Firing blank rounds, firing empty weapons without anything to fire means you're going to lose. So adding to the uncertainty, Ukrainian casualties have been so severe that commanders will have to decide whether to send units to defend Bakhmut or to use them in the spring offensive, several of the officials said. Many of the officials spoke on the condition of anonymity because they were not authorized to discuss the matter publicly. So, of course, this is a theme in the New York Times and in most Western mainstream media. They're not going to, these sources can never really be identified because they're coming from channels that are not probably supposed to be talking about this information. And also, anonymity, even in times where it makes sense, the New York Times doesn't like to divulge where exactly, even where, not even who, but where the information is coming from. And it's usually U.S. intelligence. It's usually some form of intelligence. So on Thursday, Poland said it would send 4 Soviet-designed MiG warplanes to Ukraine in what would be the first delivery of fighter jets by a NATO country, and a sign that Western allies are committed to finding a way to enhance Ukraine's chances. But artillery has become the defining weapon of the war in Ukraine, including howitzers and mortars. Both sides have powerful anti-aircraft systems, so the fighting is being waged largely on the ground. As the year-old war continues, a major factor in who perseveres is which side has enough ammunition and troops. So this is, of course, a blind spot, so to speak, for the story here. You have more than 200,000 Russians are said to have been wounded or killed since the start of the war. So you notice how they say wounded or killed. They don't want to just say killed here because no way, 200,000 Russians have not been spared on the battlefield. That's not accurate at all, but if that's a twist. But what they do say is only 100,000 Ukrainians have died on the military battlefront. That's a huge underestimate. Huge. But Russia can conscript forces from its population, which is around 3 times the size of Ukraine's, but both sides are contending with ammunition shortages. Russia's formations are firing more ammunition than Ukraine. What's so interesting about this is that they're saying Russia has ammunition shortages, yet they can't provide really any evidence of that. Russia continues to fire. They don't stop. They're firing more. So if Ukraine is firing less now because they've reduced and basically their ammunition to nil, and Russia is firing more, how could they continue to increase and escalate the rounds that they're firing if they are indeed facing shortages? That would be suicide on the battlefield, and it's just not happening. I mean, that's just the truth of the matter. It's just not happening because the war continues and Russia continues to fire away. So Ukrainian soldier fighting in Bakhmut said in recent days that we need shells for mortars. He said his battalion had not been resupplied, and a Ukrainian tank commander whose T-80 tank has been used in the city's defense said he had barely any tank ammunition left. So another commander in a brigade that has been instrumental in holding Bakhmut posted on Facebook on Tuesday that there was a catastrophic shortage of shells. He described an incident in which his unit disabled an advanced Russian T-90 tank, but was prohibited from firing artillery to finish it off because it's too expensive. So here you have Ukrainian military officials, Ukrainians on the battlefield saying, we just don't have anything left. The Pentagon estimated that Ukraine was firing several thousand artillery shells a day across the 600-mile front line, which includes Bakhmut, a city almost surrounded entirely by Russian troops. Moscow's forces control roughly half the city and are encroaching on supply lines that Ukrainians need to defend the rest. The U.S. hopes to produce 90,000 artillery shells per month, but that is going to take 2 years. The European Union is pulling resources to manufacture and buy about 1 million shells. That too will take time. And a secret British task force is leading an effort to find and buy Soviet-style ammunition, which Ukraine primarily relies on from around the world. So here you have that key word, right? Time, time, and time. Now, Ukraine doesn't have the time. Ukraine is watching as, Russians continue to make progress in Bakhmut alone, but they also have to contend with the reality that the partial mobilization that happened last year is going to be deployed at some point. And it's just a matter of what strategy Russia takes to do it, because they still have, I believe it's about 80,000 that were sent into the operational front of some kind. That doesn't mean that they're necessarily fighting on the front lines, but it does mean that they are active and they are being engaged in the conflict. But that still means 200,000+ more Russian troops on the way at some point. And when you look at the situation in Bakhmut, that's the Wagner group doing that. It's likely not going to go well after the fact. So this spring offensive is really being put into question. Ukraine has roughly 350 Western supplied howitzers, and even with battlefield losses and mechanical failures, significantly more Soviet-era artillery pieces. We have to support them more to provide more weapons, says Lithuanian's foreign minister Egidijus Malunis said in an interview on Wednesday. He cast doubt on the effectiveness of the Soviet-era weapons and said the best solution would be to find possibilities to increase production in NATO member states. I mean, this is really, again, as Brian Berletic says a lot, it's hard to know where U.S. or NATO military strategy begins and where war profiteering ends, because essentially what all that is from Lithuanian's vice foreign minister, Malunis, all he is saying is give us NATO weapons because that's what will help the military industrial complex. It doesn't really make a difference. It's not easy, even for some of the most advanced militaries in the world. The United States and its allies did not stockpile weaponry in anticipation of supplying an artillery war. Hundreds of new tanks and armored vehicles are being sent to Ukraine, will certainly aid its advance, but without enough artillery support, their effect will be limited. For now, Biden remains confident that Bakhmut will not sap Ukraine's ammunition and troops so much that it dooms a springtime counteroffensive, but the longer the battle rages, the more likely that is the change. The Ukrainians are taking casualties. I do not mean to underestimate that, said John Kirby, White House National Security spokesman, on Tuesday, but they are not taking casualties the size and scale that Russians are. And you got to I guess you just got to take John Kirby's word for that, right? Because he's someone that you can totally rely on for information about this war. No, absolutely not. John Kirby is lying through the teeth here. Ukraine's casualties are incredibly significant. Russia's are not to the scale that Ukraine is facing. Ukraine is facing. And not only about the numbers, but they talk about this war going on and on. Russia is fighting this in a battle of attrition. It's not fighting this to just roll over Bakhmut and take it within a day. No, they're fighting this gradually, and they're doing so gradually, which means, well, spring is right around the corner. Spring is essentially here. How can you wage a spring offensive if you're telling everyone that this Bakhmut battle is actually getting in the way? It's not likely to end in the next day or two. It might end soon, but again, it's a question that still is out there. It's not certain. So they're saying, the Times is saying, the story of Bakhmut alone, the numbers alone, do not tell the whole story. The site of one of the world's bloodiest battles. The Kremlin-backed Wagner paramilitary group is using units of foreign prisoners to break through Ukrainian lines. That means battle-hardened troops from Ukraine are dying as they defend the city against less trained Russian foot soldiers. So how does that make sense, right? Even just that paragraph. If you're just critical about media and how the Western mainstream media, the New York Times especially, are framing this, what does it mean for Wagner, supposedly just made up of these untrained these prisoners, these criminals, right? They're trying to make it out to be like this kind of ragtag paramilitary group that doesn't have any professionalism. And it's just, how do battle-hardened troops lose to Wagner is the question. If they are so, if they're so battle-hardened, if they're so well-trained. This isn't to say that Ukraine's military doesn't have effectiveness. It has been effective at times, but at the same time, what does it mean for Russia to be winning this battle with Wagner, supposedly this paramilitary with no talent or professionalism? Well, they're still winning this battle, and it's happening. And I think that's very significant. It shows the Ukraine military is not in the position that it says it's in. So Bakhmut is a small city, but it provides road access farther east and has become symbolically important for both sides. There's no part of Ukraine about which one can say that it can be abandoned, said Zelensky of Ukraine this month. His office announced plans to further bolster the city's defenses. The Biden administration has put a timeline on the battle there, saying that only Ukraine can make a decision about whether to pull back or keep fighting. And so now you have, the big question here coming from the think tanks, the European Council on Foreign Relations. A defense expert, Camille Grand, says that said it was both politically important and militarily necessary for Ukraine to show that it would defend its territory. But he said they need to demonstrate it's worthwhile. That is not to say there's no tactical reasons for continuing the protracted slog in Bakhmut, he said. It could drain Russia of resources and prevent its troops from heading farther west, where it could conceivably win another breakthrough for Moscow. That would be the logic of expending so much blood and ammo in Bakhmut. The alternative is that they have been dragged into a situation that in the long term plays in Russia's favor, and now it's difficult to get out of it. He said it is correct. Is it correct to assess the Ukrainians are tapping into their reserves, putting them in more difficult positions to do this open artillery barrage that would be needed to start an offensive against fortified Russian lines elsewhere? That's the big question now. So essentially what the Times is saying here is that this supposedly small battle, this symbolic battle that has been said is not going to turn the tide, but yet tens of thousands of Ukrainian troops are dying for this. And Zelensky and Ukraine's military says, no, this is actually important. But the United States and NATO continue to say, no, if Russia wins this, it's not so important, no matter the casualties, no matter the cost. And now they're saying, well, in fact, it is quite important. Maybe not because it's going to help Russia so much, although they literally admitted in this article that it actually will come out in Russia's favor for this battle to transpire as it is now, but also that it's going to hinder this so-called counteroffensive that we've been hearing so much about over the last several weeks, that it's going to hinder the ability of Ukraine to supposedly muster up its remaining weapons and whatever the US and the West are going to throw at it to to break the line, to take back territory in Donbass, and to push Russia back. All of that seems to be a pipe dream now. And the media is actually admitting this. And this is something that they've admitted tacitly for a while. They've admitted it, they've admitted it here and there every once in a while in very small print, in the very fine print. But now this is a whole major piece in the New York Times from U.S. officials. I mean, this was written by some employees at the New York Times, but they were really just copying verbatim what the Pentagon, what intelligence is likely telling them, these unnamed officials, these anonymous officials. And so this is very real. This is a very real development. Things are going to change pretty rapidly in the next several months, right? No matter how much this has been a war of attrition, a long scale, a large scale conflict that's been dragged out and dragged on and on and on, mainly by NATO. No matter how much that has been the case, there was always going to be breaking points. And we're likely seeing a breaking point now in this conflict in favor of Russia. And this has been really the trajectory all along. And, this conflict really does hearken to the rest of the world. Whatever happens in Bakhmut, however this conflict should change, however much advantages Russia should gain in the next several weeks to months, and as the spring offensive is launched, I think we're going to see the world also change, because what comes out of this Putin and Xi meeting, what comes out of China's rising role diplomatically, will have an impact on this conflict. There is indeed going to be many debates, many different kind of courses of action and proposals being made in the coming months. And likely what we're going to see is China, on the one hand, pushing for a real legitimate peace negotiation and settlement that respects Russia's interests as well as the interests of all parties involved to the extent that they can be respected, while you'll have the US and NATO scrambling, as they have been for so long, to reimagine, redeploy, and do whatever they can to prolong the conflict in a manner that doesn't hurt, for example, Joe Biden's political aspirations for the 2024 election, and of course doesn't hurt the U.S. politically in a way that would change the political calculus in the United States. That's one thing that Joe Biden wants to avoid. So we're likely going to see more doubling down, more attempts to not look weak against Russia and also not look weak against China as the U.S. election season gets kicked into high gear for the presidential elections. And we're also going to see, I think, the rest of the world working really hard, China in the lead, to try to figure out how to bring an end to this thing, or at least to begin the process of that. But in the meantime, these are the kind of developments we can expect. We can expect Ukraine to continue to struggle. We can expect Ukraine to continue to lose thousands upon thousands of soldiers, not just in Bakhmut, but all across the line. We can expect Russia to continue to make gains because they don't have the same disadvantages that Ukraine has. They're not dependent on NATO supply chains. They're not dependent on NATO and U.S. stockpiles. They're dependent on their own, and they have an economy that is organized to bring what Russia needs, what Russia's military needs, what the Wagner Group needs. And so it's just a matter of time before we see a breaking point. And it's quite clear that the United States, that NATO, that they're worried that Bakhmut is that breaking point, because it could very well break future plans. These plans for a spring offensive, it could very well break them and make it impossible, render it completely and utterly impossible to undertake. And that's huge because it means that while we can't really see an end of the horizon of US and NATO hostilities, we can certainly see a horizon for where exactly this conflict will inevitably go. And that is to some kind of some kind of change that indicates, well, Russia has been winning all along, and that Russia will likely win this conflict and be able to get a lot of the things that it wants to see implemented, minus most likely minus NATO and US participation. It will likely secure Donbass, and it will likely be able to, fight off a future kind of conflict like this. But the key thing here, though, is where the United States and NATO will stand and will continue to push in this conflict. And it's not going to be in the correct direction. So do not expect, just because the US and NATO look very weak here, they look very, there's a lot of, potential for disaster. Don't expect the course to change, because there's been no indication that it would or that it will, no matter who the political leadership in the United States is. Because and it will be really interesting to see how the 2024 election plays out on that level, because there will be a lot of pressure even on someone like Donald Trump, who has been talking about the Ukraine conflict as kind of this political talking point, selling it as he's the peace president to vote for. Be very interesting to see, should he end up in that seat, how this Ukraine conflict would play out, because it would be a huge political blunder and PR blunder for the US to withdraw, for a lot of, especially the foreign policy establishment. It would look like a huge blunder, huge loss. And yet Donald Trump and perhaps other candidates who are trying to run against Biden will take this position. A lot of the GOP is trying to take this position. Will the conflict change just because there's a power shift? However, my opinion is unlikely. However, sometimes the force of partisanship can lead to rollbacks. That is indeed very true. And I think one of the things that the Democratic Party and really the two-party foreign policy establishment, what I call the uni party of war, what they found themselves and dug themselves a deep hole in, is that by adopting the Pentagon's national security strategy as their chief political and foreign policy program, is that what they've sacrificed is this need to hide bipartisanship through partisan propaganda. And the sacrifice here is that, well, the Democrats need to look really hard on Russia, because the Democratic Party base wants to see that. And the GOP has to look really hard on China, and because their base wants to see that, regardless of whether they believe in it or don't. And that's neither here nor there. The point is that what happens if there is a shift politically in the United States, and there's been a lot of talk from the Trump side of the political aisle saying, oh, we'll get out of this war tomorrow. Will that be the case? That sounds like a political crisis of legitimacy waiting to happen. It'll be very interesting to see if that transpires and what it will mean for the conflict. But for now, we have the political leadership that we have, and it looks like the course won't change, no matter how many warnings or disasters or Bakhmut or anything else that seems to spell doom and danger for the United States and NATO in Ukraine. It doesn't really matter. They're going to continue to pursue this reckless agenda anyway. So, with that said, everyone, we're coming to the end here. All right. I think that's the end of the content for today. I just want to thank the new member who signed up, JF. Really appreciate you for signing up as a member. We have a great membership community, so you can join by hitting that join button. But with that said, everyone, I'm going to head out and depart. Before I do, be sure you hit that like button. It helps continue to get people to watch this stream. You can subscribe to the channel. These are all free ways to support me. Subscribe to the channel. Of course, check out today's sponsor for the video. Thank you so much to Ground News again. You can check that out in the video description. And be sure to support this channel. Support independent media. And the way that you can do that is by first going to some of these free options. Go to my Substack in the link in the description. Just sign up for the free newsletter. Make sure you're following me on Telegram, t.me/Danny Hypocracy. You can also find that in my link tree, which is in the description. But, if you can help sustain this channel, it would be incredibly helpful. The costs are rising. And in order to sustain this channel, I am looking for, Patreon subscribers primarily. You can sign up at patreon.com/Danny Hypocracy. That's the best way to keep this work sustainable. It helps me with getting guests on. It helps me with upgrading technology, with spending all the time on the editing work and on all of the upgrades that I need to make. So patreon.com/Danny Hypocracy. About 3 subscribers away from 500. So if you can help me out and get me there, that would be great. You can also join YouTube for $4.99 a month. Hit join. And if you end up subscribing on Substack for free, consider doing an annual subscription there. There are annual options on Patreon and on Substack. On Patreon, you can suggest guests, Patreon and Substack and YouTube. Suggest guests, ask question of guests. I've been asking those questions. I've been integrating the Patreon member questions into my interviews because a lot of them happen to be good and about content I would be speaking about anyway. So I've been asking. The first question today was from a Patreon member, Cultus, and they asked about the ICC arrest warrant. That's how I started today's stream, and I usually end also with answering whatever questions maybe had been a little more unrelated to the content. And then you can also just get my original articles. You can get perks at Patreon. You can get a PDF copy of my book right here on American exceptionalism that I wrote in 2019 before I really started this channel and really accelerated this channel and was really even focusing on things like Russia and China. So that book kind of predates and is my ideas on the U.S.'s role in the world, as well as key points in history and current events about American exceptionalism. You can get a PDF copy of that book if you join Patreon. And so, with that said, everyone, that's how you can support me. And all of you have been so generous in helping me grow this channel. It's been really great. This channel has been doing really awesome for quite a while now, and you all make that happen, especially given that you all share a very similar commitment to me to understand these wars, these conflicts, to understand the way that the world is being divided, the way that the world is developing. What exactly is geopolitics? How do things like class interests, how do things like multipolarity and the various ways that China and Russia, Iran, as well as their their counterparts in the U.S., the collective West, how they're pursuing their agendas, their interests, and what that really portends for all of humanity, really, but especially those of us who find ourselves on the outside of power, who find ourselves outside of the realms of power. Those are really the folks that need to know what's going on, because those are really the folks that need to change things, especially in our situation that we find ourselves with in the United States and the collective West. It's quite clear that people outside of the halls of power, ordinary people, working people, don't have the power to influence policy, especially in this realm of foreign affairs, of imperial affairs, of war making, of how foreign policy is delineated. We don't vote for that. We don't elect that. We don't influence that. So it's important that we are informed. It's important that we then take that information and apply it to our day-to-day lives, whether it's in efforts like organizing rallies, like what's happening, I think, right now in Washington, D.C., like what happened last month in Washington, D.C., what happens in the places locally as well, through organizations, or whether it's through our media, whether it's and just through our efforts day to day, wherever we are, in the workplaces, in the schools, wherever we are, to really push that needle and to get us ready for what will be necessary, which is not a conflict, a different kind of conflict, a conflict between the interests that we have for peace, for higher standards of living, for a different world, and the interests of those in power in Washington, in the collective West, who want to see profits for their donors, profits for their for their masters, their corporate masters who want to see their careers advanced off the backs of these wars, who want to see the U.S. reproduce itself as a unipolar empire. And that's the kind of confrontation and conflict we're going to need. So thank you for making this channel a part of getting us to a place where we can have that kind of conflict in the realm of debate, in the realm of protest and activism and whatever, right? In the realm of information. Thanks for making that happen. But with that said, everyone, thank you so much for joining this stream this morning and afternoon out in my time as you're leaving. Of course, check out the links in the description. Check out today's sponsor. Check out all the links to supporting me and how you can support me at Patreon, Substack, and you can join on YouTube. We had a couple members today join. And then you can also be sure, if you can't do any of those things or can't support, be sure to hit that like button. Make sure you're subscribing here before you head out. And I will see you all again soon. All right. I'll probably be on stream again next week. Take care and goodbye.